Okay, in the last video I was talking about, again, objective and subjective knowledge, and how these might be understood by articulating, or excavating really rather than articulating, the metaphors that underpin our understandings of what objective knowledge is and what subjective knowledge is. And I just want to reiterate that even though it doesn't feel like we're using metaphors when we say those terms, we really are, and when we're talking about knowledge at all in the abstract sense, we're making extensive use of metaphors. And what I've said is that those metaphors tend to be either about space, sensory modality, or substance, really. I think it's fascinating that there's a discussion on YouTube right now about knowledge as substance, which is informing how I'm thinking right now, at least, anyway. But what I want to try to do is to move into a discussion about about some of how these metaphors play themselves out, particularly as they play themselves out, not just in the kind of vernacular language around knowledge, because I think we all bandy around terms like subjective and objective, but as they've been tried to, as articulations have been tried to be made about what different kinds of knowledge actually consists of. In things like the knowledge management industry, or in philosophy of knowledge, or in those kinds of professions, those kinds of contexts, which have really gone into some serious thinking about what is this stuff called knowledge, how can we talk about it, what are its component parts. And certainly one of the things that you find in all of these models is that there's a very, very strong tendency to characterize knowledge in terms of binary opposites. I've talked about subjective and objective, and that's one example. But probably most structured epistemologies, structured theories of knowledge, if you like, tend to use binary systems. The one I'm going to talk about in a minute is Michael Polanyi's Tacit and Explicit, but you get procedural as opposed to propositional. I've got a list here somewhere. Hold on one sec. Well, you won't be able to find it now, of course. Oh, here we go, yeah. Theological versus schematic, deductive versus empirical, conceptual versus practical, manifest versus instrumental content, know-how as opposed to know-that, connected networks as opposed to sequences of actions, proceptual versus procedural, structural versus operational. There's just stacks and stacks of them. I'll put a link to the reference where I'm getting that list from. And as I say, most of these tend to operate in binaries, but not all do. So what I want to do is I want to just talk a little bit about the tacit and explicit, and I won't be able to fit all that in this video. It'll be 2 or 3 videos to talk about tacit and explicit out of Michael Polanyi, just to start to uncover where he's coming from and how he's mobilizing these metaphors of sensory modality, of space, and of the qualities of objects to make sense of those distinctions between tacit and explicit in his case. But once I've got that set up, I want to try to put some other epistemological systems, theories of knowledge, which don't reduce to this simple binary, but have different configurations, more interesting configurations in many ways. And what I want to try to do with that is demonstrate that even though these different epistemological systems use different terms, even though some of them have got 2 components, some have got 3, some have got 4, what I want to try to demonstrate is that they all have a consistency amongst them, and that consistency plays itself out within a shared system of metaphors, a shared schematic system of metaphors, to do, as I say, with object, space, and sensory modality. But Polanyi first. I mean, Polanyi, I really like Polanyi's writing, and he talks about the tacit and the explicit. When he's talking about explicit, and I'll do a specific video tomorrow on his understanding of explicit knowledge, he makes this characteristic that explicit knowledge and tacit knowledge they're not just opposites. The one is constitutive of the other, he says. He says explicit knowledge is that stuff that's kind of out there in the world. It has some parallels with things like propositional, declarative knowledge. It's available. In other words, it approaches a lot of the conditions of the object that I've talked about before. And as I say, when I speak about this in more detail, I'll indicate that more coherently. It has some of the conditions of an object. It's distance from the body, so it's not proximal, it's distal. And it's primarily accessed through visual metaphors. So all the metaphors around the explicit in Polanyi tend to draw on those metaphorical systems. The tacit, on the other hand, stands very close to the idea of the subject, actually, not just subjectivity, but the idea of the subject itself. It doesn't use visual metaphors. We don't talk about it in those terms. It barely uses metaphors of object at all. To the extent it does, it's not a well-bounded, clearly defined object. It's certainly not an object with a coherence that you can only access from the outside. You're kind of caught up and entangled with the object in tacit knowledge, and it's partly compositional of you as much as you are owner of it. And to the extent that one accesses it through a sensory modality at all, you would access it through feeling modalities. So the language around tacit knowledge is the language of feelings, the language of guesses and hunches and intuitions. And tacit knowledge is, as I say, constitutive of explicit knowledge. So it's not that it's, as I say, just an opposite. It's not that it's separated in space and opposite in substantial quality and use a different sensory mode. It's also constitutive, and that's something I want to go on to when I talk specifically about the tacit. Okay, yeah, I think that's pretty much all I've got to say about that right now. But in the next video, what I want to do is map out this explicit, and I'm going to be looking at partly at the etymology of the word explicit, but also how it's used in other kinds of contexts, to try to uncover what we mean by explicit. And what I want to demonstrate there is that when we say explicit, we are making the same kind of rhetorical gestures that we are when we say objective. We're making claims about an imaginary object placed at some distance from us that we're accessing with imaginary eyes. We don't know we are because it's all using covert metaphor, but that's the kind of claim I want to try to make in the next video. Okay, thanks very much for watching.